Oh, hello there. I do believe that we are live. So, welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about something that ugh, I want to talk about. Should we really take this so seriously? Um, I don't. A lot of people seem to take YouTube and other streaming platforms very seriously. Word to the wise, don't. Don't believe everything you hear on TV, the internet, or anywhere else. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk about what we want to talk about, which is AI and music. And this can mean many things because AI has many actual and potential applications for music, many of which are already being used by both professionals, amateurs, and enthusiasts alike, but many which will continue to be developed over the coming months and years and beyond. Now, for those of you who watch this channel regularly, you'll know that much of the classical recording that I love the most took place, unfortunately, before the era of high fidelity. I'm talking about the great European maestros who carried on an unbroken tradition of music making that dated back from the time of Beethoven right up until the middle of the 20th century. People like Wilhelm Furtwängler, people like Wilhelm Mengelberg, people like Stokowski in his early days. He, of course, lived so long that he lived well into the age of not only high fidelity, but stereo and quadraphonic sound. But some of his most treasured early-ish recordings in Philadelphia were either fully acoustic recordings or low-fidelity early electronic recordings. The point is, many of the great maestros throughout this era did not make it into the era of high fidelity, and therefore the collection of recordings the world has credited to these great musicians doesn't possess the audio fidelity that those of later but generally lesser conductors were able to record with. So, what's the solution? Well, over the last decades, we've seen a number of solutions. In fact, we can even go back further. Um, Not all, in fact, not even most, but some of the recordings of these great pre-war titans, obviously Furtwängler lived till post-war, and Mengelberg did as well, but was horribly stripped of his orchestra for reasons we've gone into on other streams and probably will go into again on future streams. But where was I? Right. So after the war in the 50s and 60s, in the age of the LP, some of these great Furtwängler, Mengelberg, and other recordings were released on LP, and there were various equalization techniques that were used to try to improve the sound with varying success. Relatively early on into the mass digital age, so think late 80s, 90s, other techniques using digital noise reduction and other computer editing programs were employed to try to improve the sonics of these recordings. Some of it was controversial because with quite rightly, some of it was accused of removing some of the atmosphere in the recording, which even in bad recordings, in terms of the sonics, in terms of the technology, is still there. But many of the others in the sort of 80s 90s era were given a lot of credit for making recordings that might have been so low fidelity or whose master physical format, usually a shellac disc, sometimes other things, were in such bad shape that you really needed to move mountains using what was then modern computer equalization technology to improve the sound as much as possible. And of course, as we went into the new millennium, you've got your Pro Tools workstations and just the kinds of things that were there in the 90s, but at a much more sophisticated level. And there's a company called Pristine Audio that specializes in these older recordings and making them, trying to use whatever digital methods are available to hi-fi them, if you will. So the big question then is AI, because AI can theoretically do an unlimited amount of tasks when it comes to manipulation of very specific sonic frequencies. And this opens up a world of possibilities when it comes to cleaning up the audio quality of these sort of recordings from the 20s, 30s, some of it into the 40s. I mean, obviously, sound quality did improve between the 20s and the early 40s, to be sure. We even had the introduction of magnetic tape, at least in Germany, during this period. But Most of these recordings, with the exceptions of some of the stereophonic recordings that Germany's magnetophone was doing in the sort of in the around 1944, 45, those sound really good. But a lot of the pre-war stuff, it just doesn't hold a candle to, let's say, the super hi-fi audiophile stuff that Decca and RCA Living Stereo and Mercury Living Presence and Westminster and these other great labels were putting out by the late 50s, well into the 60s. The dawning of the age of stereophonic sound, of the audiophile, of these expensive components, which were much sought during their era, and which today remain highly collectible on the vintage market because they were so well made in the 50s, 60s, and of course into the 70s. So, what can AI do to improve these 1920s, 1930s recordings? Well, theoretically, it can do a lot. With the digital workstation technology that we have now, a human will need to be there to manipulate the equalization and to apply various digital noise reduction techniques to try to improve the quality of the sound without losing any sonic information. Not easily done. It takes a level of, sophistication, having a good ear, really knowing the digital workstation tools that you'll be using in order to, not make the cure worse than the ailment. When it comes to AI, there's an ability to isolate particular frequencies that is very, very exact. AI can theoretically hear things that the human ear can't hear. Whether AI at the moment is able to detect musically correct equalization and noise reduction decisions is debatable, but what is certain is that as the trajectory of AI training technology moves forward, it will get better and better at replicating humanoid style emotions. In the year 2525, you know, I told you not to take this stuff so seriously. Anyway, commercials over. So here's my theory slash hope. I think it would be really interesting if you could run a master recording from a shellac disc, let's say, of a great Furtwängler or Mengelberg performance from the 1920s, and program the AI for as long as it takes to manipulate the sound, clean up the frequencies, enhance certain tones to make these low fidelity pre magnetic tape recordings sound something kind of like high fidelity. Whether it would be, it's obviously not going to be a recording from the 1920s is never going to sound as good as a Decca Blueback from the 50s or an RCA Living Stereo. We know that. But a lot of room for AI improvement over and above the kinds of improvements that we've been attempting to do with these recordings for the last 50 years or so, I think could be really interesting. Now, a question always that a skeptic will ask is why? And the person looking at Mount Everest will say, why? Because it's there. And to an extent, we can say the same thing about AI. Why do this? Well, because AI is there, and we might as well use it to do the most interesting things possible. But there's actually another more specific reason that I'd offer for this. These recordings of these people, these great conductors, the Furtwänglers, the Mengelbergs, the Stokowskis, the early Abendroth stuff, the early Carillon stuff, the early Knappertsbusch stuff, the um, early Bruno Walter stuff, the early Toscanini stuff, some very, very early recordings, but he was later in life at that time, of Arthur Nikesh, of the violinist Joachim, one of the great violin players, perhaps the greatest of all time. So we're talking about soloists, conductors, orchestras. These were sort of the recordings that documented how music sounded in the golden age of European romantic music, an offshoot of the great European classical tradition. These were conductors and soloists and orchestras who were the product of centuries of an oral sonic tradition passed down from one generation to another that captures the true authenticity of how music was played. And it completely refutes the idiots who came along in something post Second World War called the historically informed performance movement, who were all a bunch of morons, who didn't at all understand how music was actually performed performed in the 19th or 18th centuries, where we have the correct, the authentic, the emotionally genuine stuff from the real McCoys, the people who are the descendants of this great tradition that was passed down to them. And they are on records. Some of it, like Nikesh, is on cylinders. Some of it, like the early Furtwängler, early Mengelberg, early Stokowski, is acoustic. Some was on shellac disc. Some of the Mengelberg stuff from the 30s was on optical film, which offered some improvements. Some of the Furtwängler stuff, by the time you get into the 40s, was on early magnetic tape, which is, of course, a huge improvement, even though the tape biases hadn't been fully accounted for, and some of the masters have been lost. Some of the stuff that we've got today are copies, because after the war, a lot of stuff was looted and plundered or even accidentally destroyed. So these recordings are of the maestros. If you want to hear the way that European classical romantic music should sound, because this is the way it was performed in the lifetimes or near the lifetimes of the composers who invented this wonderful style of music, these are the recordings you should listen to. Now, why don't people who want to get into classical music, and why don't people who even already enjoy classical music listen to these recordings more frequently? The sad answer is because of the fidelity. Many people would much rather listen to a great stereophonic, high fidelity recording of a mediocre performance than listen to one of the best performances in the history of mankind recorded on a beat up shellac disc from 1929. Human nature, totally understandable. And that's why I do think a moral component comes in to this whole AI discussion. I think that people who love this music have a kind of moral obligation to keep it alive. And what better a way to keep it alive than to make it more sonically accessible to people who would love the emotional sincerity, weight, and balance of these great performances, but who don't necessarily have the sonic patience to put up with something that doesn't sound like the high fidelity sounds that they're used to. I think AI could really, therefore, play a really interesting and important role in cleaning up the sonics of these recordings, making them sound more high fidelity, at least to a great extent. And I think, well, some people will sort of respond saying, oh, well, it's not going to be that much better than these digital workstations. It's barking up the wrong tree. No, I think that AI has the capacity to do very interesting things by analyzing every sort of minutial point within the sound waves, within the frequencies that are on these recordings, and the level of enhancement that AI could provide as the software becomes more sophisticated, as the hardware, the GPUs become ever more powerful. I think we could really get to a point of view where it would be possible to hear a cleaned up version of these great recordings without losing any of the atmospheric over and undertones that could really help to convince otherwise skeptical people that these were the finest classical performances of the modern era, far better than the meek, weak, metronomic, and boring stuff which we hear today when we have the ability to record it in super high fidelity, crystal clear sound, but the performances themselves don't live up to the grandeur of the compositions that they're attempting to perform. I think this would be a much more interesting use of AI than some of the other stuff AI is being used to do, particularly to make music, because I haven't really heard any AI music that I find particularly good. I know Rick Beato does this thing where he frequently plays music that was made by AI, and it sounds formulaic. And the reason some people might think that that's okay is because a lot of the music on the radio these days is itself very formulaic. So you have people that are acting like robots and robots that are trying to copy people acting like robots. It's all a bit of a robo clusterfuck, if you ask me. Uh, well, the other complaint that I've had about that is, while AI is really good at mimicking lyrics and even sort of vocal styles, when it comes to the musical composition itself, it tends to be very lacking. This is where the real formulaic attributes of this are shown. And the perfect example of this are the things I actually listen to for fun. And that's when they sort of do these cross pollination of eras. So there's a really funny one of Tupac's "Hit 'Em Up" done in a mid-50s sort of doo-wop style. And it's really funny because it's one of the most lyrically explicit diss tracks ever, but when you put it behind, bopping and grooving sort of doo-wop music, the lyrical contrast, the contrast of the lyrical content to the overall musical style and AI vocal delivery, it's very amusing. And there's a lot of things like this. You can have Frank Sinatra singing Paradise City. You can have the jazz version of Pink Floyd. God, we have too many of those in real life already. You can have anything you want. And they're very funny and there's a novelty to them. But once you get over the fact that a style of music is being combined with lyrics that are known to us from a very different genre, so like hip hop overlaced with doo-wop, we soon realize that the AI's ability to actually compose complex or even somewhat original sounding melody lines and the ability to use anything but the most sort of basic harmony, it's relatively limited. And it will improve because AI is getting trained all the time by human stimuli. It's getting trained by the mistakes that AI itself makes. And because of that, it's always going to improve. And that's one of the things I'll particularly be looking for, seeing how AI will be able to actually compositionally improve itself over time. So that's what I think about that subject. Anyway, let me know what you think in the chat. And of course, I have to wish everyone who may or may not be listening to this stream, I have to wish them a happy Record Store Day, an event which started out as an attempt to sort of resurrect interest in record stores, which had, in the age of the computer, become increasingly niche and localized. And the idea behind it was, let's celebrate record stores, particularly the independent ones, because these are absolutely unique places. They're the places where many of us became addicted to music or got the information we needed to make more informed musical decisions. They are places of great musical education, places that in many ways are as important as any theoretical book on music, or even as important in some people's lives, more important than formal musical training. Now, um, today we have sort of the best of both worlds. If someone had come to me when such things didn't exist and say, imagine a computer, a magical computer that has every piece of audio ever commercially or amateurly recorded. Well, not all the amateurs, but you get what I'm trying to say. At the push of a button, where all you would have to do is type in the name of the song, the artist, the album, the composition, and voila, right then and there, you would be able to get it. I would say that I died and gone to heaven. That would be an absolute mind blow for, let's say, someone who didn't grow up in the streaming age or even the download age. So we're spoiled for choice. And the idea of having to trek all over a city or even all over a region in order to find that elusive disc, the idea that all of it could be done at the push of a button and that you could bring it anywhere on a mobile device, that would have been manna from heaven. At the same time, we all know that there is something about the personal touch of a record store that is missed. That the sights, the sounds, we all know the smells are something that was part of the experience. It's where people made friends. It's where people made business contacts. It's where people met other musicians who they would actually play with and maybe even go on to form successful bands with. And then there's the fact that the random mystery bin is always going to be somewhat more interesting than the algorithms which tell us, which recommend to us music that sounds like the stuff we already listen to. That's one of the big problems with these algorithms, is that they're so precise that they're trying to put something subjective, which is musical preferences, how to classify a style or a genre. They're putting this into a narrowly defined arithmetic algorithm, where there was something just sort of magical about, well, here are the mystery boxes. They're not alphabetized, they're not sorted by genres. Have fun. 8 hours later and covered in dust, you'll have found some really interesting artists, composers, recordings, everything in between, and go home with it and really say, wow. And to some extent, improvements in algorithms are allowing for this online, but not to the extent that really encapsulates that. So definitely, as much as streaming is both convenient, and nowadays you can even have hi-fi options on streaming, which is essential for someone who values that type of thing, definitely go out there and support your local record store. It's getting harder and harder for local businesses to survive because politicians are the worst people in the world. But try to help the local businessman. He really would appreciate it. And once they're gone, they're not coming back. BlackRock will buy up the property and they'll turn it into an empty building that people use for speculative value, maybe with the Starbucks whose bathroom is full of blood, drugs, and other bodily fluids, making it inoperable. So keep the small independent businesses alive, keep the record stores alive. Happy Record Store Day. And as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.